Hello, my darling, and welcome to today's story time. Today I have a special treat for you, and hopefully you enjoy it. We have in the background a Western saloon and the ambiance. And today we are starting a new story called Flames of the Storm by WC Tuttle. We will be reading this story every Tuesday and Thursday alongside Armageddon Earth until it's finished. And now, on with our story time. It was the year of the big drought in the valley of Moon River, a season when every blade of grass was worth its weight in gold to the cattlemen, who watched with jealous care over their unstaked portions of the land and guarded closely their almost dry water holes. Day after day, through the long summer, the merciless sun had baked the grass roots, browning the land, burning below the surface, until a puff of wind would drift the soil, as a wind drifts dry snow. Even the sage and greasewood turned from purple to brownish gray. Along the river, which wound its way through this crescent-shaped valley, the leaves of willow and cottonwood hummed paper dry in the hot winds, while the river itself was shrunken to half its normal summer stage. The range cattle were red-eyed, hollow of flank and dust-colored, and when they stopped to graze, their panting nostrils would send up tiny puffs of smoke like dust. In all that valley of rolling hills, which sloped upward on both sides to the hazy heights of the Shoshone Mountains, there was no sign of green vegetation. Riding down the slope of one of these hills, heading toward the river, came a tall, thin cowboy, unshaven and unshorn. The expression of his thin face was serious as he squinted into the hazy distance and spoke softly to his rangy bay horse. "Bronc, if this ain't the best place I ever seen to commit murder in, then my name ain't Skeeter Bell, Sarge." The horse snuffled at the dry grass, but did not crop at it. "Ain't much juice left in that kind of feed," declared Skeeter Bell. He removed his sombrero and wiped his brow with the sleeve of his shirt. For a few minutes, he surveyed the country before riding on. Suddenly he drew rein and sniffed at the breeze. His rather long nose quivered, and he shook his head. Beyond him a cloud of dust floated over the skyline of a ridge, growing more dense. It was impossible to see what was making the dust cloud, but whatever it was, it came over the ridge towards Skeeter Bell and dipped down into the depression beyond. "Sheep," snorted Skeeter Bell, with the true cowman's disgust of such animals. "We sure poked into fine country to poke right out of it again, Bronc." Skeeter Bell turned and rode, angling along the side of the hill, going through a heavy thicket of greasewood. Suddenly his horse jerked ahead and went to its knees. Skeeter fell head first into a thick clump of brush. As he fell, he heard the whip-like snap of a rifle, and he knew that someone had shot his horse from under him. He backed out of the tangle to investigate. His bay had crashed into some brush farther down the hill, and Skeeter could see that it was dead. He swore softly and held his gun ready. The bullet had torn through Skeeter's chaps along his thigh, missing the flesh by a narrow margin, and had broken the back of the tall bay horse. Skeeter had no idea why he had been shot at, nor how many men might be ready to shoot at him again. It was a ticklish situation, but Skeeter grimly smiled and waited. Far away, he could hear the soft bawling of sheep and the tiny tinkle of a bell. The blue jay screeched harshly from down the canyon. Suddenly, the brush crashed as if someone had stumbled into it. Skeeter glanced keenly in that direction, but did not move. In a few moments, the brush crashed again, and Skeeter grinned widely. He knew that someone was tossing rocks into the dry brush to try to get him to investigate. He snuggled a trifle lower and peered low through the tangle of brush above him. Whoever it was, they were moving very cautiously, for no sound of footsteps had come to his ears. Suddenly, his eyes focused on something. It might be part of the brush, and again, it might be the legs of a man whose body was completely screened by the heavy foliage. Skeeter considered these leg-like things very closely. Then came a dry cough, more like a wheezing chuckle, as if the man had tried to choke it and merely strangled. It came from above the legs. "Partner," said Skeeter distinctly, "I've got your legs in trouble. If you don't toss your gun over toward me, I'm sure going to interest you in a pair of crutches." The legs remained motionless, but from their owner came another wheezing cough. In fact, the man coughed for quite a while, and the visible legs shook weakly at the finish. "Now, throw over your gun," ordered Skeeter. A moment later, a Winchester rifle crashed into the brush and hung up in view of Skeeter. "Come on out, partner," said Skeeter. "Walk right down past where the rifle hangs, and I'll kindly look you over." The man was coming down through the brush before Skeeter had finished, and broke his way out into the open a moment later. "Keep your hands above your waist," ordered Skeeter meaningly, "while I look you over." The man was possibly not more than 30 years of age, yet looked much older. A stubbly beard covered the lower part of his face, and a pair of weary-looking eyes seemed to consider Skeeter closely. The man was not evil-looking, in spite of his unkempt appearance. His shirt was clean but torn, as were the worn overalls. He coughed softly again, and a flush crept across his thin cheeks. "Shucks," muttered Skeeter softly. "What you trying to kill me for, partner?" The man shook his head slowly, wearily. "What's the use of arguing about it? I'm willing to take what's coming to me. I got tired of being shot at, that's all." "Well," grinned Skeeter, "that's a plenty. If you stop to ask me. Come here, sit down." The man obeyed wonderingly. "You got a bad cough," observed Skeeter. "Go ahead," said the man bitterly. "It's my cough, not yours." "Ah," grunted Skeeter. "I beg your pardon. I'm always saying the wrong thing." He studied the man for several moments and then, "Mind telling me something? Honest to goodness, I don't know a danged thing about this here country. I just rode in. When a feller gets his bronc shut out from under him, he kinda wants to know why." The man's eyes expressed his unbelief. Skeeter laid his six-shooter across his lap and rolled a cigarette while he waited for the man to explain. "Well," began the man slowly, "you've got me dead to rights, so don't make much difference now. If you're one of the cattlemen, I'll likely get lynched for killing the horse." "Likely," nodded Skeeter dryly. "If you don't get lynched, you'll figure out that I told you the truth." Skeeter leaned a little closer and tapped the man on the knee with his finger. "Partner, if there's anything you don't want to tell the truth about, don't tell me anything. You know what I mean?" afraid I'll lie to you?" he asked. "Telling you not to. I don't care who you are, nor what you are, partner. I reckon the killing of my bronc was a mistake, but that's all past. I don't lie, and I won't stand for no man lying to me." The man looked curiously at him, wondering if this lanky cowboy was joking or not. No, he decided that Skeeter Bell was not joking. A man who would not lie and who would not stand up for a liar was a novelty in the rangeland. The man decided against provocation. "My name is Kirk," he stated. "Jim Kirk." "Mine's Sarge," grinned Skeeter. "Mostly, but folks call me Skeeter Bell." "I'm a sheep herder," said Kirk. "I'm not," snapped Skeeter. "I hate the things." Kirk nodded and dug into the hard soil with the heel of his boot. "I don't love 'em," he admitted softly, shaking his head. "Nobody does, I guess. Still." Kirk lifted his head and gazed off across the tangle of brush. "Still, they've made it possible for me to live out here." "Oh," said Skeeter. "If it wasn't for the sheep, I would probably have to live in the city," said Kirk. Skeeter cleared his throat softly. "Well, under the circumstances, sheep ain't so danged bad, I reckon. Feller does better living out here in the old hills. Maybe I'd herd sheep too. Yes, you'd do anything to keep living." "I come dang near shuffling off a while ago," reminded Skeeter seriously. "That bronc was worth a lot to me." The cough came again and occupied Kirk's attention for a period. "I'm awful sorry about your horse," he panted hoarsely. "I thought you might be gunning for me. I wanted to beat you to it." "You sure had a proper idea," grinned Skeeter. "The idea was all right," admitted Kirk. "And, as I said before, I got tired of being shot at." "Cows and sheep got a warring round," queried Skeeter. Kirk nodded slowly. "Yes. In a way, I don't blame the cowmen. This range has belonged to them ever since the first cow came in over the hill. Sheep will ruin it for anything but sheep. But the law says that sheep and cow have equal rights." Skeeter Bell snorted. The law never meant much to him. "And so the cowman takes things into their own hands, eh?" he said. "It seems that way," smiled Kirk. "Do you own the sheep?" queried Skeeter. "Me?" Kirk shook his head. "No, I'm just a hired sheep herder." "That's so," said Skeeter. Skeeter considered Kirk's humped figure for a space of time, and then said, "You ain't no hired killer, Kirk, so I take a chance on killing, or getting killed." Kirk coughed softly and got to his feet. The sun was yet an hour high, but the canyons were already blocky and purple with shadows. From farther down the hill came the bleating of sheep, the everlasting, meaningless baa, 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 from hundreds of throats. Kirk turned and looked at Skeeter. "No, I'm not a killer. I never shot at a man before." He pointed down across the brush towards the sheep. "Do you think I love those things? Sarge, I'm not physically fit to do a man's work, and I can't live inside a house. Out here in the hills, I have a fighting chance to live, and there's nothing I get to do that I can do except herd sheep." "Well," said Skeeter, "I reckon we better get 3 cheers then for the sheep. But I'm still a little hazy as to why you tried to bump me off, partner." "Self-defense," said Kirk. "I thought you was one of the gang that left the warning at my camp yesterday. They ordered me to pack up and get out. My wife and me." "Oh," grunted Skeeter softly. You got a wife with ya? Kirk nodded. A deep crease appeared between his eyes as he frowned over his own thoughts. Suddenly, he shook his head and looked down towards the sheep. It's time to take them back, I guess, he remarked. You might come down to camp with me. Have something to eat. Skeeter nodded. I'll take you up on that, partner. But I'll get my saddle first. It was only a few moments' work to strip the saddle from the dead horse and to remove the bridle. Skeeter made no comments about the dead horse. The tall bay had served him well, but Skeeter in his time had ridden many horses, and this was not the first to perish under him. Carrying the heavy saddle, he helped Kirk round up the herd of sheep and head them in the direction of the bed ground. Through a filmy cloud of dust, they followed the bleeding herd along the side of the canyon, until of their own accord, the sheep headed down to a flat where Skeeter could see an old tumble-down shack and part of an old pole corral. Smoke was issuing from the crooked old chimney, and as they drew nearer, a woman came to the open doorway and looked at them. She was dressed in faded calico and coarse shoes, but Skeeter thought he'd never seen a more beautiful face. After a searching glance at him, the woman darted from the doorway and ran to Kirk, as if partly for protection and partly to find out if he was all right. Kirk put an arm around her shoulders and turned to Skeeter. Sarge, this is my wife. Glad to meet ya, muttered Skeeter. He placed the saddle on the ground and held out his hand. The woman glanced at Kirk before she shook hands with Skeeter Bell. I killed his horse, said Kirk slowly. I thought he was one of the cowboys. That's all right, grinned Skeeter. Mistakes happen in the best of families. I've been mistaken for the same thing before. Then you're not a cowboy? Queried Mrs. Kirk. I don't know. Skeeter Bell shook his head. I've been a lot of things, ma'am, and I don't know which one took me the most. I'm just kinda going around, you see. I poked into this here country, and unless I'm misreading the signs, I'm gonna poke right out again. You'll have to get another horse, minded Kirk. Uh-huh, said Skeeter. But that's a cinch in cow country. I've got a rope left. Mrs. Kirk turned toward the doorway as she said, Supper's almost ready, Jim. And I know you must be starved. You and Mr. Sarge. Yes, ma'am, said Skeeter seriously. I sure could fold up quite a parcel of food right now. Thank you kindly. Skeeter and Kirk washed at the little spring, where a small fence had been built to block out the sheep. Does your wife like this kind of life? Worried Skeeter. Kirk shook his head as he squatted on his heels at the side of the spring. I don't think so, Sarge. But she's willing to do it for my sake. Skeeter rubbed his chin thoughtfully for a while, shook his head. I don't know much about women, Kirk. The right kind. You ain't much to look at. She's mighty pretty and sweet, but she's willing to live out here, alongside a bunch of blat and woolies, just 'cause it's gonna help you. Kirk nodded. That's love, Sarge. Skeeter squinted closely at Kirk's face and looked back toward the cabin door. Love, eh? Heat and dirt and the smell of sheep. Old rickety cabin, canned food and swapping lead with the cattlemen. No other women, lonesome ass. Skeeter looked down at Kirk and nodded slowly. Yeah, I reckon it must be love, partner, Skeeter said. I'd never seen it in that kind of package before, so I didn't see it on sight. She's my pal, my bunkie, said Kirk slowly. She's willing to go 50-50 with me in everything. That's so, said Skeeter. About being a pal. I didn't know that a woman could be that way. Women, to me, have always been, kinda. Maybe I didn't look at him right, Kirk. I kinda like that bunkie idea, you betcha. She's the best in the world, said Kirk softly, as they neared the house. I suppose, nodded Skeeter. I suppose that's right. Supper was meager in variety, as well as in quantity, but it was well cooked. I've got to go to town tomorrow, stated Kirk. We're out of food. I've been putting it off for several days, but it has become an absolute necessity. I hate that you have to go to town, Jim, said Mrs. Kirk. Under the circumstances, it's hard to tell what might happen. Don't you worry, honey, he responded. Kirk leaned across the table and patted her on the shoulder. We'll hitch up the old horse to the wagon in the morning, he continued, and be back here in 2 hours with a load of food. I've got a better scheme than that, grinned Skeeter. I'll go after your grub for you. Kirk shook his head. No, I can't let you get into trouble on our account. They would recognize that horse and wagon, and you can't tell what would happen. I'd sure like to see what would happen, said Skeeter slowly, rolling a cigarette. I'm willing if the town is, and I ain't got nobody waiting for me to come back all in one chunk. But why would you do this for us? Asked Kirk. I killed your horse, and nearly killed you. I don't know why, said Skeeter honestly. If I stopped and asked myself why all the time, I'd never do anything. Tell me something about this sheep and cattle trouble. We're from Chicago, said Kirk. I was a telegraph operator in a brokerage office till a specialist told me I must live in the hills or quit living entirely. Then we came west with no place in mind and very little money to start with. Somehow, we came to Wheeler City and met a man who offered me this job. He was sending in a lot of sheep, which were to be driven in through Table Rock Pass and then broken up into several bands. We didn't have $1 left when this offer came to us, and we accepted it quickly. It was a mighty hard trip for us, because neither of us had ever roughed it before. On this side of the pass, the herd was split into 4 parts, and a man led us to this spot. Nothing was said to us about trouble with the cattlemen. We were given a rifle and a shotgun, and plenty of ammunition. The shotgun is over there in the corner. I've never fired it. How long have you been here? Asked Skeeter. 2 weeks, he responded. 3 men were killed in the camp next to us on the first day. 2 sheepmen and 1 cowboy. The man who brought us in was arrested, although he had nothing to do with the shooting. The judge turned him loose and notified the cattlemen that the sheepmen were not to be molested until it could be fought out in the courts. The cattlemen know that it will take months to get a decision. In the meantime, the sheep are wearing out the range. Well, who owns the sheep? Kirk shook his head. I don't know. The man who hired me is named McClellan. He did not admit ownership in court, but stated that he was responsible for the sheep. You been shot at? 5 times, said Kirk. Anyway, I think they shot at me. Perhaps they merely tried to frighten me. At least a dozen of my sheep have been killed at long range. Now you spoke about a warning, reminded Skeeter. Kirk got up and took a piece of paper from a shelf above the table. It was crudely printed with a lead pencil and read, Get out and keep going. We don't like sheep, but we do like pretty women. The law ain't going to help you, none in this case. You better heed. There was no name signed to this missive, but its meaning was very plain. Skeeter squinted up at Kirk and handed him the paper. You ain't gonna heed? They wouldn't dare harm my wife, Sarge. Skeeter looked at Mrs. Kirk and back to Kirk. Partner, you're long, long ways from Chicago. Folks say that men are big-minded, big-hearted in the West. But it takes all kinds of folks to make up the West, just as it does the East. Some of these cattlemen hate a sheepherder, and if that sheepherder had danged pretty wife. Still, they was honest enough to give you a warning. Would you heed it? Demanded Kirk. Skeeter rubbed his chin and glanced at Mrs. Kirk, who was watching him intently. If you were sick and needed the work, and your wife was willing to stay with you, added Kirk softly. No, why, exploded Skeeter. Not as long as I had a shell left for my gun, or I'm able to throw rocks. That's how I feel, said Kirk. But what protection has your wife got? Asked Skeeter. You have to leave her here alone, don't you? Not all the time, said Mrs. Kirk. I go out with him quite a lot, and when I am here, I have the shotgun, you see. Skeeter crossed the room, picked up the shotgun. It was a sawed-off Winchester, with a magazine full of buckshot-loaded shells. Skeeter grinned at Mrs. Kirk. Did you ever shoot this, ma'am? No, I never have, she said. But I know I could. Said Skeeter. He placed the gun back in the corner. Perhaps we ought to try it, said Kirk. I don't know how it shoots. Oh, it'll shoot, said Skeeter. Don't you worry about that. It ain't nothing to practice with. When the time comes, just squeeze the trigger. I hope I never have to use it, said Mrs. Kirk. I hope not too, agreed Skeeter. But if you ever do have to, don't you hesitate, ma'am. I do not think I shall. She shook her head. Jim and I came out here to stay, you know, she added. That's sure the way it looks, ma'am. Do you intend to locate in this country? Asked Kirk. Me? Skeeter grinned widely. No, he said. I can't say I am. I ain't much of a locator, Kirk. I'm just kinda drifting along, mostly. I ain't got nobody to care where I wind up with my little ball of yarn. My partner got killed in Sunbeam, and since then, I've kind of moseyed along. We heard of Sunbeam, said Mrs. Kirk. A new mining country, isn't it? We thought perhaps we might go there, but there's no railroad, and they told us that it was a long desert trip. I guess it's a tough place, added Kirk. It was, agreed Skeeter thoughtfully. But there ain't an outlaw left in that town now. What became of them? Asked Kirk. Well, Skeeter rubbed his chin slowly. Well, he rode away. He rode away. Was there only one? Only one left. The rest cashed in one night. I don't know who's moved in since he left. You don't mean to say that you... Kirk stopped. Skeeter got slowly to his feet and hitched up his belt. If you folks don't mind, I'll spread my blankets out by the little corral, he said. There's room in here, said Mrs. Kirk. Skeeter shook his head and went out to his saddle. He untied the blanket roll and took it up by the little tumble-down corral. Moonlight silvered the hills, and the moon itself was stereoscopic, hanging like a huge ball in the sky, instead of showing as a flat pane. From the bed ground came the soft bleating of the sheep, while farther back in the hills, a coyote barked snappily for a moment, and wailed at his dismal howl. Skeeter wrapped up in his blanket and puffed slowly on a cigarette. He was thinking of Sunbeam and of Mary Leeds, who had come seeking her father. Skeeter had ridden away the night he had been instrumental in cleaning up the outlaws of Sunbeam, the night that Mary Leeds' father had been killed. Skeeter's partner, Judge Territon, was Mary's father, but no one knew it until after the judge had died, and Skeeter, broken-hearted over the death of his old partner, had ridden away in the night. Ridden away so that with his going, Sunbeam might be entirely rid of outlaws. He wondered what had become of Mary Leeds. He knew that the good people would take care of her. He could still hear her voice calling Skeeter Bell to him as he rode away into the night. For the first time since that night, he wondered why she called to him. He found himself comparing her to Mrs. Kirk. No, she was not as pretty as Mrs. Kirk, but they were alike in some ways. Finally, he snuggled deeper into his blankets, threw away his cigarette. The words of old Judge Territon came back to him. Keep smiling, son, and don't forget that God put a spark in you. Spark that will flare up and build a big flame for you, if you let it. Skeeter smiled seriously at the old memory of his drunken partner and eased himself into a comfortable sleeping position. And this, my darling, ends our story time for today. As always, I hope that you have very sweet and creepy dreams. Good night.